Yeah, good. Good. Possible, stay at home, please. We are working. The army is working. The entire security and defense sector of Ukraine is working.
These attacks come after Russian President Vladimir Putin declared 2 separatist areas in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine as independent and said Russian civilians who live there need protection. The battle for Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine has been going on since 2014, with more than 14,000 people killed in fighting between Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army. Now Putin has demanded Ukrainian forces retreat.
Whoever would try to stop us and further create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead you to such consequences that you have never faced in your history. We are ready for any outcome.
The operation began despite last-ditch appeals from members of the UN Security Council to ease tension. Ukraine's ambassador to the UN demanded his Russian counterpart step down as chairman.
Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
In a statement, US President Joe Biden warned of a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. There's a mood of desperation developing now. Many people just jumping into their cars, getting their families together and heading on the road, trying to get to Poland. but the main auto routes are all jammed. There are so many people trying to do the same thing. Others, the missiles are getting. Emergency meetings have been called to reach an agreement, while the shelling and build-up of military troops on this is Ukraine's darkest day.
Andrew was saying in his report there from Kiev, people queuing up there at blood banks to make donations just in case it gets. There are different cities all over Ukraine, and the interesting thing about Ukraine, different cities, when I talk about different cities, I mean different cities that to what the Russian forces may or may not do in the coming hours, as close to the border as those two breakaway republics, so Moscow, so they need to get ready for every eventuality. As long as they last for us. We'll talk to Andrew Simmons live from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Just take us through.
Let's deal first with those blood banks, because that's
Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Well, Mariupol is one of the cities under attack. The mayor there says they will fight back.
I want to reassure you that our military spirit is at the highest level. Nobody will surrender Mariupol. We will defend our city and our land.
Okay, we have eyes and ears all over this story for you here on the News Hour. Let's go live to Charles Stratford in Mariupol in the southeast of Ukraine. Charlie, just give us a sense what's been going on there today. Where are you? What have you been seeing and hearing?
Well, as we speak, Peter, the shelling has picked up again. Certainly behind me, what sounds like very heavy artillery. It had died down in that area. That's east of the city, even closer to the front line. Certainly over a couple of hours this afternoon, it was a sustained barrage of heavy shelling. As I say, that's just starting again. We understand, according to some of our sources, that the military were using some of the high-rise buildings in residential areas in that area east of the city to try and repel this kind of heavy artillery. Interestingly as well, in areas that we have been visiting over the last few days, northeast of the city, we're hearing potentially very worrying reports from villages that we were in, A very heavy shelling indeed. People that we've tried to reach out to, lost contact with now. We spoke to them earlier in the day. They were saying that the shelling was intense. They were hiding in their basements. We earlier on today, in our tour of the city, a city, as I say, that certainly earlier today seemed relatively calm. We saw we saw people queuing up at banks, desperate to get money out of ATMs. We saw huge lines of cars of people trying to get petrol as well. People obviously desperate to try and leave the city, but we visited a checkpoint, or very close to a checkpoint west of Mariupol, and this is what we saw. I'm close to a checkpoint on the outskirts of Mariupol. Military vehicles behind me, heading down a road heading west. Don't know whether you can see quite yet. On the other side of the road there is a convoy of tanks appearing. In the last 10-15 minutes or so, we've heard the distinctive thud of what sound to be Grad missiles being used. These are these missiles that are, just leave you that so you can see the tanks coming out, heading into Mariupol. But as I say, in the last few minutes we've heard distinctive sounds of Grad missiles being used in the not too far distance. Now, across the field here, there are Ukrainian military installations that we understand were hit earlier, billowing smoke coming from them. Another couple of tanks. Interestingly, that tank being towed suggests it may well have been hit. But yeah, also increasingly we've seen more and more people leaving from this checkpoint. This checkpoint, the road going down towards the west, towards cities like Verdansk on the Azov Sea, as well as Dnipro in the northwest. And interestingly, we have been speaking to a source in the Navy in around Verdansk who says that earlier today, naval forces off the coast of the Azov Sea, off the coast of Verdansk, came under fire from Russian naval vessels, forcing them back to base. And we're also getting reports, again, that we cannot verify, that Russian forces may be planning an attack from the north of Crimea in towards cities like Kherson and Melitopol, which, as I say, are west from here.
Let's go back to Charles Stratford. Charlie, compelling stuff there when you were out a little earlier today in daylight. I guess the sun has set where you are right now, or it's setting. Going back to the top of your first answer, though, Charlie, is it possible to tell who is firing or who is responding when you're listening to that crump of fire off in the distance? Because if the Ukrainians are responding, if the Ukrainian army is responding, it's a very local war. It's a full-on war between Ukraine and Russia, I guess. But if the Ukrainians are not responding, what is it? I mean, is it then just a massive Putin-orchestrated drive-by shooting?
No, it's fair to say that the Ukrainians are responding. They have certainly no choice. What is interesting, though, is that we've been speaking to sources further up along the 420-kilometre front line in and around areas like Donetsk, which, of course, is Russian-backed, separatist-controlled. And people in that area are saying that, OK, there has been a lot of shelling. The Ukrainian military are telling us that there has been a lot of shelling. But there isn't a sense of a push being made by the separatists, which is very interesting. It seems as if the Russian forces are at least trying at targeted positions, targeting the military. And as I referred to in that report that we just heard, We've subsequently got more details about what we understand from sources of the ongoing fighting north of Crimea in towns like Kherson and Melitopol. Now, these are hugely strategic towns because, according to military analysts, that kind of push that is being made by Russian forces out of Crimea could well be seen as an attempt to link a corridor between Crimea and where we are now, which is effectively the beginning of the front line on the Eastern Front, Mariupol. And the reason why analysts are telling us that is because they are trying to get control, the Russians are trying to get control of water resources that the Ukrainians blocked in 2014, 2015. The Ukrainians are responding. I mean, as I say, the barrage that they are being subjected to at the moment dictates that. They have very little choice indeed. This could nowhere near be seen as anything like a local conflict at this stage, and especially as we've been reporting these attacks around the country, not just here in Mariupol, not just north of Crimea, but of course Kiev, around Kharkiv also. So, yeah. It's getting dark now. We've been told by the authorities here to expect not a blackout, but they will be keeping the electricity or encouraging lights not to be used. It's going to be a very dark and a very frightening night for millions of Ukrainians tonight.
Charles, thank you very much. Charles Stratford, our correspondent there, live for us here on the News Hour in Mariupol. Well, Leonid Pashechnik is the separatist leader of the self-declared Republic of Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. He's giving his full backing to this Russian military operation.
This is the moment we have been waiting for. For the past 8 years of suffering, of patience, the residents of Donbass have been ridiculed. They have been suffering. We recall 2014 when the Ukrainian militarymen killed Donbass residents because they wanted to speak the Russian language. We wish to remain loyal to the Soviet Union, our brother and sister in the fatherland. We have a common, shared, great history. We have not raised the issue of secession. We have not perpetrated killing. We didn't impose ideology. We simply requested to remain loyal to our land, our home, and to remain with our faith in the Russian atmosphere and to stand up to the Ukrainian militias.
Live now to Moscow, and our correspondent covering the events there, Bernard Smith. Talk to us, Bernard. Where's Mr. Putin today? What's he been saying?
Groups are doing. Other arms of the Russian government, though, have been talking more expansively recently about the military action. The Russian Defense Ministry has issued a statement saying they've destroyed 70 military targets and 11 airfields. And they say that the high-precision weapons of the Russian armed forces are destroying only military infrastructure. They're accusing Ukraine's security services of staging scenes in Ukrainian towns with alleged victims of attacks amongst the civilians. They say this is the idea of the Ukrainians is to accuse Russia of being indiscriminate and disproportionate in its airstrikes. But Russia says there's no danger for the civilian population. And also quickly we heard from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, when asked about sanctions. He said that Russia had enough safety tools to survive market volatility during this emotional reaction, he described it, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he said it's impossible to shut off Russia behind an iron curtain. It's a long time since we've heard reference to the Iron Curtain, but Dmitry Peskov brought that image back up for us again today.
Isn't it just? Bernard Smith there reporting live from Moscow. Bernard, thanks very much. Well, what's unfolding right now is, of course, the biggest attack by one state against another state in Europe since the dying days of the Second World War. In the coming hours, EU leaders are meeting in Brussels for a special summit to prepare their response to Russia. There has been strong condemnation from top officials across the EU.
Later today, we will present a package of massive and targeted sanctions to European leaders for approval. With this package, we will target strategic sectors of the Russian economy by blocking their access to technologies and markets that are key for Russia. We will weaken Russia's economic base and its capacity to modernize. And in addition, we will freeze Russian assets in the European Union and stop the access of Russian banks to European financial markets.
These are among the darkest hours for Europe since the end of World War II. A major nuclear power has attacked a neighbor country and is threatening reprisals of any other state, consequences ahead of us.
Well, NATO has put more than 100 aircraft warplanes on alert. It'll be reinforcing its eastern flank with those. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says the alliance wants to prevent conflict, but he also said NATO would defend itself if necessary.
NATO's core task is to protect and defend all allies. There must be no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. This is our collective security guarantee. Today, the North Atlantic Council decided to activate our defense plans at the request of our top military commander, General Todd Walters. This is a prudent and defensive step to protect and shield allied nations during this crisis. And it will enable us to deploy capabilities and forces, including the NATO response force, to where they are needed.
OK, let's go live now to Berlin, and our correspondent there, Dominic Kane. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been speaking in the past few hours. Dom, hi there, welcome back to the News Hour. So diplomacy, Dominic, is not dead, maybe quite difficult to find a pulse at the moment. What can the Europeans do next?
Well, what many of the European leaders are doing right now is taking part in a virtual G7 summit called by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. It had been pre-planned, but we can imagine that the agenda has been dominated by what's taking place in Ukraine. Once they've had that virtual summit meeting, which is taking place, led by the Chancellor, taking place perhaps 300 metres away from where I'm speaking to you now, Peter, well, once they've done that, then in the next few hours they're going to have an extraordinary EU summit meeting to talk about the Ukraine crisis, to work out what those sanctions that Ursula von der Leyen was referring to. Very, very condemnatory tone coming from her, coming from the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, coming from the French President Macron, coming from all sorts of different heads of government or heads of state around the Western world. What can they do? They can give us more detail about what specifically those sanctions will be, who they will target, how they will target them, and what sort of duration they will have. And remember, the EU is meeting, as I say, in Brussels this afternoon, this evening, European time. And then tomorrow there's going to be a NATO virtual summit, again, convoked this time by Secretary-General Stoltenberg, who has been speaking and being very strong in his words of condemnation. So, sanctions from the EU and then reassurance from NATO to the member states on its eastern flank that an attack on one, an attack on all. That's Article 5 of NATO, which has been the bedrock of support for NATO inside NATO since its inception at the end of the 1940s, an era when it was NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. Is it now going to be NATO versus Vladimir Putin's Russia? Because remember, NATO's eastern flank might well be perceived in Moscow as Russia's western flank. We know that President Putin has always said that he was very concerned about the expansion eastward of NATO. Well, in response to what his government and its forces are doing in Ukraine right now, we hear the Secretary-General of NATO saying more troops, more resources, more weapons being sent to safeguard NATO's eastern flank. So lots of meetings taking place, Lots of very condemnatory words, a really harsh tone coming from all those Western leaders. What we haven't had quite yet is the detail of what those sanctions will be.
Dominic, thanks very much. Dom Kane, our correspondent there in Berlin. Fast-moving situation, of course. It is incredibly confused. What we're showing you right now, though, continuing on with this idea of the backstory, the febrile atmosphere to what's going on in eastern Ukraine. This is Pushkin Square in the Russian capital. Russian police, Moscow police, clearing the streets there of a demonstration of people, presumably Ukrainians in Moscow. Of course, there is a massive diaspora of Ukrainians all over Russia, all over the world, indeed, I guess, but particularly in Moscow, because they go there to get jobs, because the economy of Russia is stronger than the economy of Ukraine in some senses. But there has been an anti-war, an anti-conflict protest. Russian police moved in quite quickly. Numbers, not clear on the numbers for you. Scores, definitely. Hundreds, can't say that. Definitely can't say thousands, but there you can see people returning to normal sunset activities on the sidewalk, on the pavement there near Pushkin Square, as the Russian police had moved in to clear that anti-demonstration. Presumably as well, they would self-identify as saying they were anti-Vladimir Putin. Well, displaced Ukrainians have been crossing into neighbouring Poland as well. What is usually a rather quiet border area did see an increase in crossings on Thursday. Hospitals have prepared beds for any wounded Ukrainians. The military is now on alert. Hungary, Slovakia and Lithuania are also sending troops to their borders.
We haven't been sleeping for the last 2 nights, so we've been watching it pretty closely, and then I just called it when I saw it. Yeah. I think there were reports of Kharkiv and Mariupol getting approached on, so then I just knew that we had to get out, and this was always our plan, to come here.
At 5 o'clock some colleague called me and say war started, and we with wife decide put all our things in the Lviv and come back here. Before that we from Mariupol and we together moved to Lviv yesterday, and today we're here.
We also have got some live pictures coming in to us from the border area there. Ukrainians fleeing that Russian invasion. They've started trickling across the border, dozens arriving at those normally quiet areas. Officials in the EU countries bordering Ukraine, I mean, we're talking about Poland, Romania, I guess Slovakia as well, said there has been no massive influx of refugees for the moment, but local media reporting and telling TV news channels such as ourselves that they are seeing a lot of foot traffic. That is definitely increasing as people try to get away from what they think is heading their way. Well, to the UK, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he will work with allies to restore the sovereignty and the independence of Ukraine.
For all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free. I say to the British people and all who have heard the threats from Putin against those who stand with Ukraine, we will of course do everything to keep our country safe. We're joined in our outrage by friends and allies around the world. We will work with them for however long it takes to ensure that the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine is restored. Because this act of wanton and reckless aggression is an attack not just on Ukraine, it's an attack on democracy and freedom in Eastern Europe and around the world.
Niamh Barker is our correspondent who was watching that address to the nation from Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister. Niamh, I mean, very, very strong words there, referring to Mr. Putin as the Russian dictator, and it very much a kind of a post-Cold War speech from a British Prime Minister. He seemed to be saying, look, we can't normalise this by doing nothing.
Yeah, the delicate language of diplomacy has completely fallen away, mainly because we're no longer in a position where Western leaders are trying to deter Russia from doing something by taking a softly, cautious approach. Now, countries like the United Kingdom and its EU and American allies are in the position where they have to now defend their own countries against possible Russian aggression, not only in Ukraine, but the ramifications of that potentially rippling westward and affecting the British economy as well. Just to add to what Boris Johnson said, we also gathered that Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, had invited the Russian ambassador to the Foreign Office, essentially for a dressing down. That ended up in an incredibly heated exchange lasting only 10 minutes, the Russian ambassador leaving very quickly after being accused of lying repeatedly to the United Kingdom. Truss apparently saying that he should be ashamed of himself. I think it's pretty much an understatement to say that relations are at an all-time low. Boris Johnson saying that the UK, in parallel with what we're about to hear from the EU and the United States, will launch a first salvo of sanctions aimed squarely at the Kremlin. We've got a rough idea of the outline of some of them, including stopping Russia from selling sovereign debt in the UK, usually in the form of foreign currencies in the shape of bonds, to essentially stop Russia from bankrolling this ongoing conflict. Also, it's been described as being one of the biggest assaults, I suppose, on some of the oligarchs that are present here in the UK, that obviously have billions of dollars worth of their assets here in the British capital. It's believed that as many as 100 Russian oligarchs might well find themselves at the receiving end of this new raft of sanctions from the British government.
Understood. Copy that, Niamh. Thanks very much. Niamh Barker talking to us out of the Shard in London. Now, to Washington, because the US President Joe Biden is speaking to G7 allies to come up with a coordinated response to the Russian invasion. Earlier, he released this statement. He said, President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone is responsible for the death and the destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and a decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett monitoring events for us there up and down the streets of Washington. Kimberly, when he announces the second tranche of sanctions, which we think will happen later today or first thing tomorrow morning your time, what do they do beyond that?
Well, that is certainly the big question here in the United States. In fact, that is something that has been asked by congressional members especially. So we're watching carefully to see what the U.S. president will have to say. He is expected to speak to the American public at 17:30 GMT, where he will not only talk about his meeting with the G7 leaders that is currently underway and that joint response to this invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but what these sanctions will look like, and also what the American public could expect in terms of potential retaliation from Russia, in terms of how this could affect them and their bottom line. For example, the spike in oil and gas prices, how that could translate to higher prices for American consumers. So the U.S. president expected to make that case, but also outline beyond those sanctions what the American public could expect moving forward. And I can tell you, Peter, that the appetite by the American public for this conflict is pretty low. In fact, just 26% of Americans believe that they should be involved in this in any sort of way. So this is going to be a tough case for the U.S. president to make, but it's one that we expect he will make, as he says that there is an obligation of the United States to stand up for American values and democracy in Ukraine.
Kimberly, for the moment, thanks very much. 17:30 G, it's in the diary. We will come back to you, I suspect, between now and then for another conversation. OK, 2 days ago, we started reporting on this channel the predictions of the impact of a conflict, a war. Call it what you will, a drive-by shooting. Doesn't matter how you label it, inside eastern Ukraine. The predictions from various financial analysts were about the impact that that could have on the global world market. Let's have a look at the biggest, the best measure of that, the Dow Jones. Has it had an impact? Yes, it absolutely has. The Dow Jones, they're down 2% by 659 points right now at the moment, standing at just 32,500. Gas prices have surged by 40%. Oil is now above $105 a barrel for the first time. That's the first time that's happened since 2014. Gabriel Elizondo joins us live from the stock exchange in New York. Hi there, Gabe. So energy costs for everyone around the world were going up anyway, and it looks like it's going to get worse.
Yeah, that's right. The markets are watching energy particularly closely today because, as you mentioned, oil over $100 a barrel. And most analysts here in New York are predicting that that could stay above $100 a barrel, or at least there close to that range for a long time to come. The mood here in New York on the markets is basically a little bit of shock, even though there was warnings that this Russian invasion could be happening for several days now, coming out of Washington and other capitals around the world. The markets certainly are reacting to shock to this, and you see investors basically running away from the market, and that's why you're seeing the stocks tumble globally, but here in New York as well. As one analyst said, he goes, this is sort of the worst case scenario that we're facing now. And even though he said that we were prepared in a sense that we were getting warnings that this could happen, this is certainly the worst case scenario, at least from the market standpoint. The global economy had already been struggling to try to come back from nearly 2 years of the pandemic. There's already inflation concerns, supply chain issues, and now war in Europe. Certainly, as one person told me, he said this is a confluence of a perfect storm. The markets are tumbling here in New York. We expect it to continue. But again, a close eye on energy because that is key.
Gabe, thanks very much. You'll keep us posted, I'm sure. But in the meantime, thank you. Gabriel Elizondo there. Dow Jones down by just over 2%. OK, here is the full range of Russia's military offensive, such as we know it to be so far. It is far beyond Donetsk and Luhansk, the areas held by separatists, which Russia does recognize now as independent republics. That kicked in, 56 hours ago now. Russian forces have come from all sides, multiple directions. We're talking about from Belarus in the north down to that Sea of Azov. Joining us live on Skype from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is Colin Clark. He's a senior research fellow at the Sufan Group. Colin Clark, welcome to the NewsHour. Can Ukraine fight back successfully?
Well, Ukraine will fight back, but, it's clearly overmatched, both in qualitative and quantitative terms. I think, U.S.-supplied Javelin missiles will be significant for the Ukrainians, but, to go up against one of the world's largest and most sophisticated militaries in Russia is a tall task for any nation.
Do you think Mr. Zelensky has what it takes? With due respect to Mr. Zelensky, he's a guy who came to public prominence in Ukraine as a comedian, playing the part of a Ukrainian president in a comedy show. That was his footprint into global politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, again, it's going to be a tall order for Mr. Zelensky, but I've been impressed so far. I think he's listening to the right people. He's getting good advice. He's leaning on Western military strategists and others that, have studied this issue for a long time. Again, it may just be an impossible task going up against aggressive Russian kinetic actions coupled with cyber attacks, coupled with, a very virulent information warfare campaign that the Kremlin's been waging for weeks now.
Can the Russian military keep it going in as much as there is a perception that the Russian military is big, well-resourced, well-funded, latest, high-tech? There's talk of a cyber war going on in the background. And yet the reality of, for example, the Russian Air Force is that it's not that big, it's not that new, it's not that efficient.
You're right. Your points on the Russian Air Force are well taken. We've seen what the Russian Air Force does in Syria, in other theaters, in other contexts. The issue for Moscow is they don't really care about civilian casualties or collateral damage. And so if their smart weapons aren't that smart and end up killing civilians, from Putin's vantage point, so be it. And so I think, you have to think about the differences in mindsets between NATO, Western, European kind of militaries and Russia's, which is quite different.
Colin, I'm just going to try and pull up the map again one more time of that whole area of sort of central to eastern Ukraine. I don't know if you heard the conversation we were having with Charlie Stratford, our correspondent. He was making the point that there is a lot of speculation going on that the Russian military, what they want to do is they want to create a corridor from that far eastern area of Ukraine down to Crimea. So if that is a stretch for the Russian military, is one of the potential endpoints here for Mr. Putin, creating a greater annexed area that encompasses Crimea, going down there into the sea, up to Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Donbass region.
Yeah, without question. And I think, as he continues to cleave off more territory, think about it as a buffer zone. That's essentially what Putin is trying to build out right now. And I think the point in your earlier interview was well taken in the fact that NATO's eastern flank is perceived as Russia's western flank. So there's a battle of wills right now. There's a battle of militaries trying to push the line out as far as possible. In Russia's case, with Ukraine attempting to hold the line. And I think, we're likely to see in the coming days and weeks, Russia continue to make progress and expand that buffer zone further west.
But what does that buffer zone then mutate into being? Because if they manage to pull that military rabbit out of the hat and turn it into some sort of, you're using the phrase a buffer zone, what does it then become? Because it can't stay as a country. It can't become a protectorate, because we're not talking about, say, the former Baltic republics here. We're not talking about Lithuania, Latvia or Estonia, countries of 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 million. Ukraine is a big place. It's 40 million people.
You're right. I think in Putin's
by doing nothing. But first tranche of sanctions, big wow, largely symbolic, excuse my cynicism. Second tranche of sanctions, they will clearly have a targeted impact on a lot of people who are very wealthy, but have got money socked away in other locations apart from London and the New York Stock Exchange. Of course they have. So what are the outside military planners, the NATO military planners thinking about now, and what are they capable of doing?
Well, I share your cynicism for the reasons that you just mentioned. It's almost as if Europe is just waking up to the fact that it's got a dependence on Russian natural gas and that the UK is awash with dirty Russian money. No kidding. Now is the time to do something about it. So was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Putting that aside, I think the strategy for NATO right now becomes raising the cost to the Kremlin. So arming the Ukrainians and basically messaging to Putin that should this conflict drag on, the West is prepared to back Ukraine in a what will be a very long and costly insurgency for the Russians. Death by 1,000 paper cuts is one way to think about it. An asymmetric or unconventional irregular warfare approach to meet what the Russians bring to the table, which is also this kind of hybrid warfare gray zone approach. And so kind of giving Russia
probably old enough to remember why Chernobyl is such a red flag, a genuine red flag of danger for all of Europe. 1986, one of the reactors there had a meltdown. That caused because that particular nuclear power plant was old and decrepit. And hadn't been maintained properly. So that's a danger. perhaps off in the distance at this point in this conflict in eastern Ukraine, but it's still a danger which we will keep an eye on for you. Let's talk to Carl Leno. He's CEO of the Centre for European Policy Studies. He joins us via Zoom from Brussels. Carl Leno, what's
I have the impression that most Europeans, and the fact that we are afraid. I think until today, so 70 years later, I mean, we have not been capable to build a European defense. We need, of course, we have
to personal approval ratings, he's always sky high. When he decided to change the constitution so he could stay in power until 2036, he put it to a referendum. Russians voted for it. Russians like Vladimir Putin.
How credible these referendums were, we don't know. Of course, we know there are certain approval ratings sometimes. Let's say what he's done to Russian economy, let's say, isn't too bad in the end. I mean, meaning Russian, if you compare it to 20, 25 years ago when Russia was in crisis, let's say they're much better off today. But if you then see, for example, that he then carries Belarus, the neighbors of Belarus, into a war, to provoke a war from Belarus also against Ukraine, do you think the Russians approve that they want to go into war? I don't think so, because basically the reason why Putin is doing this is to say, look, we are all one group, Slavic the Slavic populations. And the Russian speakers in Ukraine are suppressed. But that doesn't mean, let's say, that he should start killing people over there. So that may backfire against Putin. Let's hope from our perspective that it backfires against them. Say, once there are many victims that will be seen by the Russians, I mean, on both sides, above all, it will be seen by the Russians as something, a totally unnecessary conflict. And also, let's say, I think the bad thing is that Russia now is clearly, as many people have commented already this morning, a state like North Korea, or even worse, totally a pariah in the international system. So what I hope is that the United Nations will come up with a very clear condemnation, as well from the Americas, from Asia, from Europe, and other parts in, let's say, Australia, New Zealand, etc., and that it will show that what Russia is doing is totally against all norms of the international order. Of course, that's what you hear here in Brussels, which then raises the question, what can we do in the end to bring this man to other ideas? And of course, that remains the open question. I think the first thing we need to do as Europeans is to have a strong deterrence and to show that we are capable of defending ourselves, that we shouldn't be afraid of a madman in the Kremlin.
Carl Leno, 24th of February, Thursday, 2022. Is it possible that this is just day one of a very long, very nasty, very messy conflict that, more importantly, perhaps even than that, will colour and perhaps change Europe's relationship with Moscow for a very, very long time?
The last thing is certainly sure, it will change the relationship with Moscow for a very, very long time. Of course, it depends how long it will last. I hope that if the reaction of the international community is strong enough, and then I look precisely to China, what will China do? Will China accept, let's say, that what Russia is doing to its neighbors could also happen to China? Or could China do this to other neighbors? And if China takes sides of the international community, then Russia is isolated. If China sides with Russia, then we have a big problem. And then the conflict would last very long. So what I hope, let's say, the conflict will be short, and that probably...
Okay, Mr. Leno, I'm going to pause you there again and say thank you very much, because we've got Mr. Zelensky talking, not live, it's a tape feed, and I just want to go to that now. Thank you so much.
But we have forces to hold them there. Our forces got the order to kill the Russian paratroopers in Hostomel. Yes, we have losses. We have some prisoners of war from Russia. Our doctors are helping the Russians who surrendered. We destroyed a lot of planes, warplanes, and some armored vehicles. Some of the Russians, they're saying that they're against the war in the social media, but I doubt if the Russian authorities will see that. That's why, yeah, I will ask you, if you hear us, if you understand us, if you understand and realize that you're advancing to the independent country, just please go out and address your authorities and your president. Now your military started war.
I don't think so.
War in our country.
Putin is doing this is to say, look, we are all
and
one
I
group
really wanted that you express yourself in the Red Square or elsewhere in your capital, Moscow, St. Petersburg, some other cities and towns of Russia, not only in Instagram. It's very important. What we see at this moment, Russia is turning into the full version of DNR, full isolation. Russia just started getting big sanctions from the most powerful in history sanctions package. Nobody will force us Ukrainians to give away our freedom, our independence, our sovereignty. But it looks like the Russian leadership is trying to do it just by the way of destroying their own country. Now, everything is getting burned quite literally in front of the whole world. We emphasize it's not Ukraine who chose the path of war. but Ukraine calls to turn back to peace. What to do? Help our national defense. Join our territorial defense and armed forces. And if you have military experience, it will be very, very useful. And then we'll defend our independent country. Please help the volunteers and medical workers, for instance, giving blood. And the politicians and the local leaders should be helped. Just make sure that the life is normal as far as you could do, as far as life could be normal. And you just take care of your neighbors, of your friends. And now to the journalists, defend the democracy and the freedom of Ukraine. I spoke today with the world leaders, with Great Britain, USA, Sweden, Germany, Poland, Austria, Romania, and many others. If you, dear European leaders, dear world leaders, leaders of the free world, if you won't help us today, if you didn't show your strength of help, war will be knocking at your door. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the Ukraine armed forces.
We've lost it. Apologies for that. We've lost the translation there of Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Let's just take you through very quickly in the next 20 seconds or so what he was saying, because the translation maybe could have been a little smoother, perhaps, but just ironing out some of those rough edges for you. He said, "We have prisoners of war." That's his claim. He's claiming they have Russian prisoners of war. He also said we've destroyed a lot of planes. He also called on Ukrainians to express themselves wherever they are. We've seen that anti-Russia protest in Pushkin Square in Moscow. He was talking about Ukrainians in St. Petersburg. Wherever you are, get up and show your support for Ukraine. Well, world leaders have widely condemned the Russian invasion of what is, of course, another sovereign nation. Moscow now faces another round of sanctions from Western allies, and they're promising to make them hurt. Jonah Hull from London.
As missiles fell on Ukrainian cities, so international condemnation rained down on Vladimir Putin and the Russian attack.
Early this morning, Russian troops invaded Ukraine, a free and sovereign country. And once again, in the center of Europe, innocent women, men and children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack.
Later on Thursday, EU leaders will meet to discuss developments that they'd hoped against hope wouldn't happen, and the scale of which now none could entirely have foreseen. From national capitals, leader after leader promised a coordinated and unprecedented sanctions response aimed at President Putin, the Russian elite, and the sources and havens of Russian wealth, hoping against hope again that they will make a difference. US President Joe Biden joined a Zoom meeting of G7 leaders. In a statement earlier, the US president said Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, diplomatic niceties aside, describing Vladimir Putin as a dictator.
For all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free.
But while determined efforts continue by a number of countries to supply Ukraine with lethal and defensive weapons, no one is offering to stand shoulder to shoulder with Kiev and fight.
We have made it clear that we don't have any plans and intention of deploying NATO troops to Ukraine. What we have made clear is that we have already increased, and we are increasing the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance on NATO territory.
That will not be a factor in Putin's plans for now. and neighbouring countries have other problems to consider. The Polish government says 9 reception points will be opened along Ukraine's border to receive an expected wave of refugees. A country that in recent months has used force to repel refugees from the Middle East must now brace for Ukrainians fleeing war in their thousands. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera.
It's 16 hours GMT, that's 6 p.m. exactly in Kiev on the day that Russia invades Ukraine. I'm Peter Dobby with our continuing coverage of the fast-paced developments. A barrage of Russian strikes across Ukraine since early in the morning. A number of civilians and soldiers have been killed. The bombings trigger an exodus. Thousands flee to try and find shelter to save their lives. Ukrainians lining up to donate blood as the injured are rushed to hospitals. Okay, let's get going. Ukraine under attack from land, air and sea. Major cities and military bases are under fire. What's unfolding is the biggest attack by one state on another in Europe since the Second World War. Here's the full range of Russia's military offensive. It is far beyond Donetsk and Luhansk, the areas held by separatists, which Russia recognizes as independent republics. Russian forces have come from all sides, from multiple directions, from Belarus in the north down to the Sea of Azov. And that is the soundtrack of war that many Ukrainians woke up to today. These are apparently Russian helicopters near Kiev firing flares. They're seen near what's believed to be the Hostomel. Kiev says it's a full-scale invasion, an assessment shared by NATO and Western allies. The Kremlin's describing it as the demilitarization of Ukraine. The West is promising to hold Moscow accountable with, quotes, painful sanctions. We'll be live with our correspondents, our eyes and ears on the ground in just a moment. First, this report with the latest is Andrew Simmons reporting out of Kiev.
The months-long build-up of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine has turned now into an invasion. Ukraine under attack. Military bases, airports and aircraft have been targeted and bombed. The skies over multiple cities, including the capital Kiev, lit up, waking up residents in the early hours of Thursday as Russian artillery advanced.
Not very many could have predicted that he would be striking at so many multiple targets.
The civilian casualties are unknown, though Russia says it will only attack military posts. As a response, Ukraine has declared martial law.
I had a conversation with US President Joe Biden. The US is starting to gather international support. Today we need you, each of you, to be calm. If possible, stay at home, please. We are working. The army is working. The entire security and defense sector of Ukraine is working.
These attacks come after Russian President Vladimir Putin declared 2 separatist areas in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine as independent and said Russian civilians who live there need protection. The battle for Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine has been going on since 2014, with more than 14,000 people killed in fighting between Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army. Now Putin has demanded Ukrainian forces retreat.
Whoever would try to stop us and further create threats to our country, to our people, should know that Russia's response will be immediate and lead you to such consequences that you have never faced in your history. We are ready for any outcome.
The operation began despite last-ditch appeals from members of the UN Security Council to ease tension. Ukraine's ambassador to the UN demanded his Russian counterpart step down as chairman.
Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell. Ambassador.
In a statement, US President Joe Biden warned of a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. There's a mood of desperation developing now. Many people just jumping into their cars, getting their families together and heading on the road, trying to get to Poland. But the main auto routes are all jammed. There are so many people trying to do the same thing. Others are going underground, taking shelter. The missiles are getting closer now. Emergency meetings have been called to reach an agreement, while the shelling and build-up of military troops on both sides continues. This is Ukraine's darkest day. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
Well, Charles Stratford was earlier today outside Ukraine's port city of Mariupol, where several explosions were heard. He did see a convoy of tanks, some flying Ukrainian flags.
I'm close to a checkpoint on the outskirts of Mariupol. Military vehicles behind me, heading down a road heading west. Don't know whether you can see quite yet. On the other side of the road, there is a convoy of tanks appearing. In the last 10-15 minutes or so, we've heard the distinctive thud of what sound to be Grad missiles being used. These are these missiles that are, just leave you that so you can see the tanks coming out, heading into Mariupol. But as I say, in the last few minutes we've heard the distinctive sound of Grad missiles being used in the not too far distance. Now, across the field here, there are Ukrainian military installations that we understand were hit earlier, billowing smoke coming from them. Another couple of tanks. Interestingly, that tank being towed suggests it may well have been hit. But yeah, also increasingly we're seeing more and more people leaving from this checkpoint. This checkpoint, the road going down towards the west, towards cities like Berdansk on the Azov Sea, as well as Dnipro in the northwest. And interestingly, we have been speaking to a source in the Navy in around Berdansk who says that earlier today, naval forces off the coast of the Azov Sea, off the coast of Berdansk, came under fire from Russian naval vessels, forcing them back to base. And we're also getting reports, again, that we cannot verify, that Russian forces may be planning an attack from the north of Crimea in towards cities like Kherson and Melitopol, which, as I say, are west from here.
Charles Stratford reporting there. Well, there has been a rush for food and other basic supplies. Hoda Abdelhamid reports now from a supermarket in the eastern Ukrainian town of Kramatorsk.
It is quite surprising to sort of see that how collected they are, quite orderly. No one is pushing and shoving. But that's, I think, is because this conflict has been going on for 8 years. Nothing has been resolved. Both Kiev and the separatist leaders have not been able to find any kind of solution. The relations with Kiev and Moscow have been deteriorating very over these past 8 years, and then certainly ever since this crisis has started a few months ago, it's gotten worse and worse. So people knew that something will happen. People knew that eventually there would be an escalation. I don't think they expected it now. Just a few weeks ago, they were brushing off the idea of an invasion, and then things changed very, very quickly for them. Maybe today they're following the news that at the moment, mainly, or what we're hearing is that the military installations are being targeted. There is certainly no any kind of visible army or fighting on the streets here. It's all quite calm. But They know war, they have seen war. This city had been going between the hands of the Russian-backed separatists and the Ukrainian army. That has seen fierce battles. The next door city, Slavyansk, which is only a 10-minute drive, was the epicenter, really, of the base. The Russian-backed separatists had spread all the way there, had set up a base there, and it was a fierce fighting to get it back. So people know what it means. People know what could unravel on their streets, and they're taking their precaution. But it's quite, would I say, surprising, admirable to see how calm and collected they are. And there is no sense of, even when you look at their faces, they're just there. They know it is a very serious situation, but you don't have a feeling. They're not expressing it at the moment. Is the best way I could describe it.
Leonid Pashernik is the separatist leader of the self-declared Republic of Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. He's giving his full backing to the Russian military operation.
This is the moment we have been waiting for. For the past 8 years of suffering, of patience, the residents of Donbass have been ridiculed. They have been suffering. We recall 2014 when the Ukrainian militarymen killed Donbass residents because they wanted to speak the Russian language. We wish to remain loyal to the Soviet Union, our brother and sister in the fatherland. We have a common, shared, great history. We have not raised the issue of secession. We have not perpetrated killing. We didn't impose ideology. We simply requested to remain loyal to our land, our home, and to remain with our faith in the Russian atmosphere and to stand up to the Ukrainian militias.
Live now to Moscow, and our correspondent there in the Bureau, Bernard Smith. Bernard, so business as normal today for Mr. Putin. I guess he's trying to send out a very particular signal here.
Yes, he was trying to make it look like that, Peter. He had a meeting with Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan at the Kremlin, and the official statement from that meeting was that they discussed cooperation between countries, exchanged views on regional issues, including the situation in South Asia, not the situation in Ukraine. So a fairly anodyne statement and an indication that Vladimir Putin just wants to give this perhaps indication that all is carrying on as normal. There have been further comments, though, from the Foreign Ministry and the Defence Ministry. The Defence Ministry put out a statement earlier on saying they'd hit at least 70 military targets, amongst them 11 airfields, and they were keen to say, the Russian military spokesman, that the high-precision weapons of the Russian armed forces destroy only the military infrastructure. They are accusing the Ukrainian security services of staging scenes in Ukrainian towns with alleged victims amongst the civilians. They said the Ukrainians are trying to accuse Russia of indiscriminately firing, but the Foreign Defense Ministry said there is no danger for the civilian population. We are not targeting Ukrainian towns. And also we have just heard from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman. He was saying Russia is ready for sanctions. We know it has a cushion of some $631 billion, a quarter of Russia's economy, to protect itself from all the sanctions that are going to be incoming. Peskov said it is going to be impossible to shut off Russia behind an iron curtain. First time we've heard reference to that in a few decades.
Bernard, thank you very much. Bernard Smith there talking to us out of Moscow. Well, world leaders have widely condemned the Russian invasion of another sovereign nation. Moscow now faces another round of sanctions from Western allies, and they've promised to make them hurt. Jonah Hull has that story from London.
As missiles fell on Ukrainian cities, so international condemnation rained down on Vladimir Putin and the Russian attack.
Early this morning, Russian troops invaded Ukraine, a free and sovereign country. And once again, in the center of Europe, innocent women, men and children are dying of fear for their lives. We condemn this barbaric attack.
Later on Thursday, EU leaders will meet to discuss developments that they'd hoped against hope wouldn't happen, and the scale of which now none could entirely have foreseen. From national capitals, leader after leader promised a coordinated and unprecedented sanctions response aimed at President Putin, the Russian elite, and the sources and havens of Russian wealth, hoping against hope again that they will make a difference. US President Joe Biden joined a Zoom meeting of G7 leaders. In a statement earlier, the US president said Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said diplomatic niceties aside, describing Vladimir Putin as a dictator.
For all his bombs and tanks and missiles, I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians and their passionate belief that their country should be free.
But while determined efforts continue by a number of countries to supply Ukraine with lethal and defensive weapons, no one is offering to stand shoulder to shoulder with Kiev and fight.
We have made it clear that we don't have any plans and intention of deploying NATO troops to Ukraine. What we have made clear is that we have already increased and we are increasing the presence of NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance on NATO territory.
That will not be a factor in Putin's plans for now, and neighbouring countries have other problems to consider. The Polish government says 9 reception points will be opened along Ukraine's border to receive an expected wave of refugees, a country that in recent months has used force to repel refugees from the Middle East, must now brace for Ukrainians fleeing war in their thousands. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera.
OK, let's gauge the European reaction. Dominic Keynes in Berlin. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was speaking a little earlier today. Dom, so what options does the EU have now, do we think, moving forward?
Well, the funny thing about this is that the EU leaders who, in one sense, are decisive are the French president, the German chancellor, and they've been taking part in a virtual summit of the G7 leaders, which has broken up in the course of the last 45 minutes, 50 minutes, Peter. And if you'll allow me to read the statement that they've come up with, it is pretty strong, in fairness. It goes to what Jonah was just telling us in his report there about sanctions, the options that are available. And you won't be surprised to hear that they condemn the actions of Russia, the invasion of Ukraine. They express their unshakable solidarity with Ukraine, and then they go into detail about the sorts of things that they consider to be important going forward about energy stability in the world and the availability of energy supplies being guaranteed. Well, that clearly is a reference to the gas markets and the oil markets. Remember that gas and oil, natural gas and oil, are major cash crops, as it were, revenue generators for Russia, and could conceivably be targeted in sanctions. And so there is reference to that in the statement that's coming from the G7 leaders. Remember, that takes in, the group of 7 takes in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, all of them expressing solidarity. And of course it includes the EU institutions, Ursula von der Leyen and President Charles Michel as well. Interestingly, the G7 leaders are also effectively expressing their very serious condemnation of the role of Belarus in this situation. Remember, we've seen the pictures of Russian armour, tanks and armoured personnel carriers apparently crossing the Belarusian border into Ukraine on their way to Kiev, was the suggestion. Well, the G7 leaders talking about the situation in Ukraine and Belarus and condemning the role of Ukraine. Now, this has been dropping in the course of the last few minutes, but it's clear the G7 leaders are trying to make very abundantly clear their position here. The Japanese Prime Minister is saying that he is looking at targeted economic sanctions against Russia that would be painful and would make the Russian government realize what he considers to be the error of their actions. This doesn't necessarily mean that this exactly what's being put out here is what the EU leaders will agree, but it is suggestive, strongly suggestive, that what we'll hear from Brussels in the hours to come is a variation on the theme that this statement is putting out there. And remember, it's not the only meeting that's taking place in the course of the next 24 hours. We know that NATO is going to have a virtual summit in Brussels again tomorrow, where further action may be being discussed. But pretty clear coming from the G7 leaders there, their real condemnation of what President Putin's troops are doing in Ukraine and what they believe the way forward should be.
Dom, thank you very much. Dominic Kane there joining us live here on the programme as part of our continuing coverage out of Berlin. Now, the UK is expected to announce more sanctions against Russia. Niamh Barker joins us from London. So, as we were discussing a little earlier, Niamh, strong words from Boris Johnson talking about Vladimir Putin having unleashed a wave of violence in eastern Ukraine. But the reality is the posture of NATO hasn't changed. Their people are, quote, ready, but it's a backup support function at most. So beyond sanctions, where next?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? Yeah, it is. When I was at NATO headquarters last week, ahead of course, this invasion, it was NATO's central identity, I suppose, to reiterate time and time again that it is a defensive organisation, that it poses no threat to Russia, and as such, Russia should freely come to the negotiating table with the NATO alliance and sit down and hopefully come to a nice solution to all of that. That clearly has not happened, but in many ways, the UK, as a NATO member, its hands are tied when it comes to providing any more military support to Ukraine. It's a very, very difficult tightrope to walk, because if the UK and other NATO alliance countries do too much, it could be drawn into a protracted conflict in a country that it has no existing treaty to defend. But if it does too little, then it could be a gift horse, I suppose, to Vladimir Putin. And clearly he sees the opportunity now to launch this invasion. You know, just building on what we heard there from Dominic in Berlin, I think the question now is, OK, NATO members are all singing from the same hymn sheet. EU members are all singing from the same hymn sheet. So is the UK as well. What about the speed in this, though? Because it can be a very slow process getting all EU 27 member states to agree to anything. We know that sanctions are on the way in many different shapes and forms. But the speed of this is going to be absolutely crucial in sending the right signal to the Russians as quickly as possible. Moscow can achieve an awful lot within 48 hours. We've seen over the course of the day already a tremendous amount has happened. If the UK and EU and NATO alliance don't act quickly, the situation will be incredibly complicated, and sanctions will be less effective than they hope they will be if they don't act immediately.
Niamh, thank you very much. Niamh Barker there with breaking down for us what's going on in London amongst the political leaders there in the UK capital. Let's bring in Alexander Bratetsky. He's a senior political analyst for Finam News website. He's also a political scholar at Memo. That's an international think tank. He joins us from Moscow. Alexander Bratetsky, you've been waiting there a long time, sir. We do appreciate you standing by to talk to us here on our continuing coverage of what's going on in eastern Ukraine. Question one. Is stage one for Vladimir Putin creating some sort of rump Ukraine light buffer zone / protectorate going from Crimea across to Luhansk up to Donetsk and encompassing the Donbass region there, where all the fighting is going on in eastern Ukraine at the moment?
That's definitely maybe his goal, historical and maybe political, as he, in his address to the nation, has dismantled the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, which was created by the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin. But actually, I don't think so he is politically acting for this, because this will be actually the end of his political regime. And he is now seen as sort of like a dictator of sort, like Saddam Hussein, and even the attack on Ukraine can be seen as an attack of the United States on Yugoslavia in 1991, regardless of Mr. Milosevic's action, that was an interference into an independent country. And Putin, who mentioned the Yugoslavia, was actually doing almost the same. So it looks like he is trying to use this kind of a scenario where he would pressure the Ukrainian authorities for peace, maybe in 2 days or 3 days, because to have that long-standing war with Ukraine would be actually very expensive, even for the Russian budget. The Russian economy is not in good shape. Ukrainian army was going to be fighting back, and also the partisan movement. We should take this into account. So the things are very serious for Vladimir Putin right now. So, and it's very important where he would stop, to pressure Ukraine to negotiate or to go further, which I don't think so would be.
Why do you say he's perceived as being a dictator in Russia?